Arthur Rossi arrived at the hospital to see his daughter in intensive care when suddenly a nurse grabbed him by the arm and hid him in a storage room. "Shoo, trust me and watch." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. A minute later, what happened made his blood run cold. The phone had shattered the freezing Chicago darkness like a brick through glass. Arthur fumbled for it on the nightstand, knocking over the water glass he kept there. The screen glowed harsh and white, unknown. His heart was already racing before he pressed the button, before he was even fully awake. "Mr. Rossi." A woman's voice, shaky. "Wrong somehow. This is Chicago Lakeside Hospital. Your daughter was brought in an hour ago. Critical condition. You need to come immediately." The words punched through his chest. He sat up, the heavy winter sheets tangling around his legs. What happened? What kind of emergency? A ruptured brain aneurysm, serious complications. Please come now. The line went dead. Arthur stared at the phone. Something about that voice. Now, pressed against the cold metal shelving of the hospital supply closet, the memory of that frantic phone call clicked into place. The shakiness in the woman's voice had not been fear. It had been the tremor of a poorly rehearsed script. The nurse beside him, Sarah, slowly released her grip on his forearm. Her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion and quiet fury, met his in the dim fluorescent light. She raised a trembling finger and pointed toward the narrow crack in the heavy wooden door. Arthur leaned forward, bracing himself to see a gurney, a team of frantic surgeons, or a blood-stained floor. Instead, the pristine white corridor was completely empty, save for three figures casually strolling toward the staff coffee machine. The first was a man in a tailored white coat, the head of neurology, judging by his arrogant posture and the badge clipped to his lapel. Beside him walked Nathan, the man married to Arthur's daughter, checking his phone with an expression of profound boredom. And between them was Elena. There were no bandages. No shaved scalp. No signs of the catastrophic arterial burst that had set Arthur driving recklessly through a blinding Chicago blizzard just an hour prior. Elena was dressed in her signature cashmere wellness lounge set, her skin glowing with expensive serums, a steaming cup of artisan coffee resting delicately in her hands. She laughed. The sound echoed off the sterile tiles, bright and utterly devoid of suffering. Arthur stopped breathing. His hands, which had been trembling with a father's ultimate terror just moments before, slowly curled into tight fists. The edge of a metal shelf pressed sharply into his back, but he did not move. He did not make a single sound. "You are sure the scans look convincing?" Elena asked, her voice carrying that same soft, practiced cadence she used when lecturing her clients about spiritual awakening and mindfulness. The doctor took a sip of his coffee. "I use stock imagery of a severe subarachnoid hemorrhage. It is indistinguishable to a layman. The surgical theater is prepped for the performance aspect. But my cut is not open for negotiation. 50,000. Nathan looked up from his screen, his jaw set in an ugly sneer. 50,000 is steep for printing a few fake medical sheets, document. You are extorting $150,000 from a wealthy old man, the doctor countered smoothly. My risk is considerable. You want the tragic narrative, you pay for the production. Elena placed a gentle, manicured hand on the doctor's arm. Her smile was a mask of serene benevolence, a flawless display of the illusion of the ego. Let us not focus on the material aspect, she murmured, weaponizing her spiritual vocabulary with chilling precision. My father is drowning in his attachment to his wealth. It is a heavy, dark energy that stunts his soul. By transferring this $150,000, we are not stealing. We are liberating his karma. We are doing him a profound spiritual service. And you, doctor, are merely being compensated for facilitating his healing journey. In the cramped darkness of the supply closet, the father Arthur Rossi had been a desperate, loving, terrified elder died quietly. The grief was instantaneous, violent, and entirely silent. He mourned the daughter he thought he had raised, the little girl who used to hold his hand walking down the icy streets of the city. That girl was gone. Perhaps she had never truly existed at all. In her place stood a hollow, narcissistic parasite wrapped in a veneer of counterfeit enlightenment, gleefully plotting to strip him of his life savings over a cup of midnight coffee. The panic that had driven him through the storm evaporated entirely. In its wake, a glacial, terrifying calm settled over his mind. It was a familiar sensation, an old friend waking from a long slumber. Decades ago, before he built a legitimate logistics empire, before the quiet life of reading Eastern philosophy and playing solo chess, Arthur had survived the unforgiving underworld of Chicago by being the coldest man in any room. He had been a silent godfather, a man who never raised his voice, because the quietest men were always the most dangerous. Emotion was a liability. Emotion made men careless. He watched Nathan chuckle at Elena's twisted justification. He watched his daughter sip her coffee, completely detached from the unimaginable agony she had purposefully inflicted on him. They thought he was a naive, wealthy old fool. They thought they were the predators circling a helpless prey. They had severely miscalculated. Sarah, the nurse, touched his shoulder lightly, her face pale. She whispered that she had overheard them plotting in an empty ward and could not let an innocent father destroy his finances for a lie. Arthur turned to her. The absolute stillness in his eyes made her take a small step back. "Thank you, Sarah," Arthur whispered, his voice smooth and level. "You have done me a great service tonight. Do not say a word to anyone about what you have done." He did not burst out of the closet. He did not scream or demand answers or confront them with their betrayal. That would be hot, messy, and temporary. The best revenge required patience. Arthur Rossi simply smoothed the lapels of his heavy wool coat, adjusted his breathing to mimic that of a shattered, desperate old man, and prepared to step onto their stage. If his daughter wanted a tragedy, he was going to give her a masterpiece. Arthur waited until the footsteps faded down the corridor and the soft chime of the elevator signaled their departure. He stepped out of the supply closet, the harsh fluorescent lights washing over his weathered face. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, locking away the ruthless syndicate boss he had once been and calling forth the fragile, terrified father they expected to see. He made his shoulders sag. He forced his breathing to become shallow and ragged. He willed his hands to tremble, a physical manifestation of a broken heart. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 412, the performance began. The room was a masterpiece of theatrical despair. The lights were dimmed to a somber, clinical gray. Monitors beeped in a steady, synthetic rhythm that meant absolutely nothing. Elena lay propped against a mound of stark white hospital pillows. She wore a cervical collar that was entirely unnecessary for a brain aneurysm, and a thin, clear tube ran under her nose, delivering oxygen she did not need. Her face was arranged in a portrait of brave, quiet suffering. Arthur stumbled toward the bed, letting out a choked, breathless gasp. He reached for her hand. Her skin was warm, pulsing with perfect health, but she let her fingers go limp in his grasp, playing the part of a woman teetering on the edge of the abyss. "Dad," she whispered, her voice weak and strained. "You came." "I am here, sweet girl," Arthur said, letting his voice crack. He sank into the plastic chair beside the bed, burying his face in his free hand. "I am right here." "What happened?" "The nurse on the phone, she said it was a rupture." The door opened behind him. The head of neurology entered, his face set in a mask of practiced gravity. The man Arthur had just seen laughing by the coffee machine now moved with the solemn grace of a seasoned professional delivering a death sentence. Nathan stood close behind the doctor, his posture stiff, projecting the image of a devastated husband holding back tears. "Mr. Rossi," the doctor said, his tone low and sympathetic. "I am Dr. Aris. I am so sorry we are meeting under these circumstances. Your daughter suffered a severe subarachnoid hemorrhage. The pressure in her skull is reaching critical levels. We stabilized her temporarily, but the aneurysm is in a highly precarious location." Without immediate surgical intervention, the risk of permanent cognitive loss or death is absolute. Arthur looked up, his eyes wide with manufactured terror. Then operate. Do whatever you have to do. Save my daughter. Nathan stepped forward, placing a heavy, comforting hand on Arthur's shoulder. The touch felt like a crawling insect, but Arthur leaned into it, playing the desperate elder seeking support. Arthur, the surgery requires a specialized clipping procedure. This facility is out of network, and the insurance company classified the emergency intervention as experimental because of the specific microscopic tools needed. They are refusing to cover the upfront costs. How much? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Aneurysm met his gaze without a hint of shame. $150,000. We need to book the surgical theater within the next 48 hours. If we wait longer, the window for a successful recovery closes. Arthur let his hands shake violently as he gripped the metal bed rail. He stared at his daughter, the girl who had calmly discussed his financial ruin a mere 10 minutes ago. Elena squeezed his fingers weakly. Real tears pooled in her eyes. It was a spectacular display of sociopathic control. "Dad, no," she murmured, turning her head away as if the burden of her existence was too much to bear. "Do not do it. That is your retirement. That is everything you have saved for your peaceful years. I have spent my life teaching people to detach from the physical realm. Maybe this is my time to transition. You cannot give them that money. I will not let you." The words tasted like poison, wrapped in a shiny coating of spiritual enlightenment. She was using the very philosophies he enjoyed reading to manipulate him into emptying his accounts. She knew exactly what a loving father would say to a child accepting death. "Do not speak like that," Arthur choked out, forcing a sob into his throat. "Money is just paper. You are my flesh and blood. You are my only child. I will not let you die because of some insurance technicality." "It is too much," Elena wept softly, closing her eyes. "I just want you to be happy, Dad. I want you to be free of attachments." "You are the only attachment that matters," Arthur replied, matching her melodrama perfectly. Nathan squeezed Arthur's shoulder tighter. "I tried to get a loan, Arthur. The banks will not approve anything this fast. I am useless. I cannot even save my own wife." The fake anguish in Nathan's voice was almost comical, knowing the man was merely sweating over a gambling debt. Arthur stood up slowly, moving like a man carrying the weight of the entire world. He looked directly at Dr. Aneurysm. The doctor's eyes held a brief, imperceptible flicker of greed, a silent victory dance. "Schedule the surgery," Arthur said, his tone filled with desperate resolve. "I will go to the bank the moment it opens tomorrow. I will have a cashier's check for $150,000 delivered directly to your office. Just keep her alive. We will do everything in our power, Mr. Rossi," the doctor promised smoothly. Arthur leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Elena's forehead. It took every ounce of his willpower not to recoil from the contact. "Rest now, my sweet girl," he whispered. "Daddy is going to fix this. I promise you." He turned and shuffled out of the room, keeping his shoulders slumped until he reached the elevator banks. The doors slid shut, sealing him inside the mirrored metal box. As the elevator descended, the shaking in his hands stopped instantly. His tears dried. His posture straightened, rising back to his full height. The broken father vanished, leaving only Arthur Rossi. He pulled his coat tight against the chill. He had promised to fix this, and he always kept his promises, just never in the way his enemies expected. Arthur walked out the sliding glass doors of Chicago Lakeside Hospital into the teeth of a brutal blizzard. The icy wind held off Lake Michigan, whipping snow across the empty parking lot, but Arthur barely felt the freezing temperature. The cold inside his chest was absolute. He unlocked his heavy sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The heater roared to life, pushing warm air against his frozen hands, but his mind was already miles away, calculating, strategizing, and building the architecture of a flawless ruin. He watched the hospital entrance through his rearview mirror for a long moment. He pictured his daughter upstairs, adjusting her fake oxygen tube, laughing with her arrogant doctor, entirely unaware that she had just awakened a sleeping monster. Arthur did not drive back to his expansive, quiet estate in the northern suburbs. Going home meant returning to the sanctuary he had built for his retirement, a place of peace, chessboards, and philosophy books. Tonight was not about peace. Tonight was about war. He steered the car south, navigating the treacherous, snow-covered streets with the steady precision of a man who knew every dark corner of this city. During his decades building a logistics empire, he had dealt with thieves, liars, and extortionists. He understood the fundamental mechanics of betrayal. But this betrayal, orchestrated by the child he had raised and protected, required a level of surgical eradication he had never employed before. The tires crunched over fresh snow as he pulled into the parking lot of a neon-lit diner on the edge of the industrial district. It was a relic from a bygone era, the kind of place where truck drivers and insomniacs drank black coffee in utter silence. The bell above the door jingled weakly as Arthur stepped inside. The air smelled of burnt grease and old vinyl. He slid into a corner booth facing the door, an old survival habit from a dangerous past life that he had never completely unlearned. A tired waitress poured him a cup of black coffee without asking. He wrapped his hands around the thick ceramic mug and let the silence settle over him. Arthur pulled out his phone. He did not dial a saved number from his contacts. He typed the digits slowly from memory, a sequence he had not used in over 15 years. The line rang 3 times before a gruff, gravelly voice answered the call. "Speak," the voice demanded. "Frank," Arthur said softly. "It is Arthur Rossi." A heavy, weighted pause hung on the line. When Frank spoke again, the gruffness was replaced by sharp, immediate attention. "Boss. It has been a very long time. I thought you retired to read your philosophy books and watch the snow fall." "Retirement is a luxury I can no longer afford," Arthur replied, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "I have a severe pest problem, Frank. It requires a discreet exterminator." Frank had been a top-tier private investigator and a vital asset to Arthur during his days running the underground side of the logistics syndicate. Frank knew how to follow dirty money, how to unearth deeply buried secrets, and how to operate entirely outside the boundaries of the law without leaving a single fingerprint. He owed Arthur his life and his career, and his loyalty was beyond question. "Give me the names," Frank said. The old title of respect slipped out naturally, an echo of the absolute authority Arthur still commanded. "Elena Rossi," Arthur said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "And her husband, Nathan Hayes. I need everything you can find on them. Pull the financial records for her wellness retreat center. Dig deep into Nathan and his supposed tech startups. I want to know who they owe, how much they owe, and what filthy secrets they are hiding behind those perfect, spiritual smiles." "Your own blood, Arthur?" Frank asked, a hint of genuine surprise breaking through his hardened professional exterior. "That is cold." "She is no longer my blood," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "She is a liability that needs to be neutralized. There is also a neurologist at Chicago Lakeside Hospital. Dr. Aris. Check his bank accounts, his offshore holdings, and any malpractice suits that got swept under the rug. I want his entire life laid bare by tomorrow evening. You will have a preliminary dossier in 24 hours, Frank promised. Do you want me to bring the boys out of retirement? Send a physical message. No, Arthur commanded quietly. Violence is loud and temporary. I want them destroyed legally, financially, and permanently. They are trying to steal $150,000 from me. I want to know exactly why, and then I will take everything they have left. Arthur ended the call and set the phone face down on the Formica table. The underground network was officially reactivated. He looked out the diner window into the swirling blizzard. The winter storm outside was nothing compared to the storm he was about to unleash upon the people who had dared to mistake his quiet love for foolish weakness. Exactly 24 hours after the meeting in the dimly lit diner, Arthur Rossi sat in the heavy leather chair of his private study. The blizzard had passed, leaving the sprawling grounds of his suburban estate buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent snow. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rows of philosophy books and the solitary chessboard on the mahogany desk. His laptop chimed softly. An encrypted file had arrived from Frank. Arthur opened the dossier. It was meticulously assembled, a digital autopsy of the lives his daughter and son-in-law had meticulously curated. He began with Elena. For years, Arthur had viewed Elena's business, the Aura Wellness Institute, as a harmless, new-age vanity project. She hosted expensive retreats, preached about mindfulness, and sold overpriced herbal supplements to wealthy, bored housewives. Frank's deep dive, however, revealed a much darker reality. Beneath the glossy brochures and serene social media posts, the institute was a predatory, underfunded pyramid scheme. Elena was not a healer. She was a master manipulator. The financial ledgers showed exactly how she targeted emotionally fragile individuals, people desperate for purpose or grieving profound losses. She used the esoteric language of Eastern philosophy to isolate them from their families. She taught them that material wealth was a toxic anchor holding back their spiritual ascension. Under the guise of shedding this material weight, she pressured her clients into emptying their savings to pay for exclusive, advanced-tier enlightenment courses. But the illusion was collapsing. Frank had intercepted communications between 3 former high-profile clients and a ruthless corporate law firm. They had awakened from Elena's psychological conditioning and were quietly preparing a massive class action lawsuit for fraud and emotional abuse. Elena's center was bleeding cash. She had drained the operating funds to maintain her luxurious lifestyle, and the impending legal defense alone would bankrupt her completely. She was a grifter wearing the mask of a spiritual guru, using the concept of a pure ego to cover a hollow, ravenous greed. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was one thing to steal from a wealthy father. It was a uniquely vile act to prey on the vulnerable while wearing the robes of a saint. He turned the digital pages to Nathan Hayes. If Elena was a sociopathic predator, her husband was simply a pathetic coward. Nathan loved to present himself as a tech visionary, a brilliant entrepreneur always on the verge of launching the next billion-dollar startup. The truth detailed in Frank's report was humiliating. Nathan had not launched a successful business in his entire life. His phantom projects were merely smoke and mirrors designed to attract venture capital, which he then squandered on luxury cars, expensive watches, and high-stakes underground poker games. When the legitimate investors dried up, Nathan had made a fatal error. He sought funding from the shadows. Frank uncovered a trail of debt leading directly to a syndicate operating out of the south side of Chicago, men whom Arthur had deliberately avoided during his own time in the underworld. Nathan had borrowed $50,000. With the exorbitant, illegal interest rates applied by the loan sharks, that debt had ballooned to exactly $80,000. Frank had included transcripts of intercepted text messages sent to Nathan's private phone. They were not polite requests for repayment. They contained specific, graphic promises of physical violence. The syndicate had given Nathan a hard deadline. He had mere days to produce the $80,000, or they would start breaking bones. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as the complete picture crystallized in his mind. The pieces of the puzzle fit together with sickening perfection. The fake ruptured brain aneurysm. The theatrical performance in the hospital room. The demand for exactly $150,000. It was an act of absolute, frantic desperation. $80,000 would go to the South Side Syndicate to save Nathan from having his legs shattered. The remaining $70,000 would be funneled to the Aura Wellness Institute to quietly settle with the disgruntled clients and keep Elena's fraudulent spiritual empire from crumbling into dust. They were not just greedy. They were cornered rats, drowning in a swamp of their own lies and debts. They looked at Arthur and did not see a father who loved them. They saw a floating piece of debris they could use to save themselves, completely indifferent to whether they pulled him under the water in the process. Arthur closed the laptop. The grief he had felt in the hospital supply closet was entirely gone, replaced by a glacial, procedural focus. He now knew their exact pressure points. He knew their fears, their deadlines, and their weaknesses. To destroy them permanently, he did not need to confront them or shout accusations. He simply needed to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. The trap required them to feel safe. It required them to believe they had won. Arthur picked up his phone and prepared to make the next move. He was going to invite the wolves into his home. Arthur picked up his phone and dialed Nathan. He let his voice waver, perfectly mimicking the exhaustion of an elderly man overwhelmed by grief. The excuse was simple and unassailable. Elena had been temporarily discharged from the hospital to stabilize her blood pressure before the delicate surgical clipping procedure could commence. Arthur insisted that she could not possibly recover in her own cramped apartment. He demanded they pack their bags and move into his sprawling suburban estate immediately. He cited his vast, quiet rooms, his organic meals, and his ability to keep a watchful eye on her round the clock. Furthermore, he casually mentioned that having them close would make it much easier to finalize the transfer of the $150,000. He told a convincing lie about his bank requiring tedious, in-person authorizations over several days for such a massive, sudden withdrawal. That was the irresistible bait. Arthur knew they would never refuse close proximity to the old man and his checkbook. Arthur had exactly 48 hours before they arrived. He did not waste a single minute. He called Frank again and requested a technician, someone who specialized in invisible, corporate-level surveillance. A nondescript plumbing van pulled up to the estate the following morning. A quiet man in a generic utility uniform stepped out carrying 3 heavy black equipment cases. For the next 8 hours, Arthur watched in stoic silence as his peaceful sanctuary was transformed into a high-tech observation deck. The technician worked with surgical precision. He drilled microscopic holes into the ornate crown molding of the main living room, inserting wide-angle cameras no larger than the head of a pin. He placed thermal motion sensors in the downstairs hallways to track their movements at night. The most crucial installations were the audio recorders. High-fidelity, omnidirectional microphones were concealed inside the antique crystal chandelier above the dining room table. Another recording device was glued firmly beneath the heavy mahogany coffee table where they would undoubtedly sit to discuss their finances. Every whisper, every sigh, every hurried footstep would be captured, encrypted, and routed directly to a secure, silent server housed in a locked steel cabinet inside Arthur's private study. The house was no longer a home. It was a digital courtroom, and Arthur Rossi was the presiding judge, jury, and executioner. On a gray, bitterly cold Thursday afternoon, Nathan's car pulled into the circular driveway. Arthur stood on the porch, wearing a thick wool cardigan, forcing his shoulders to slump and his expression to soften into anxious vulnerability. Nathan stepped out first, playing the role of the devoted, exhausted husband to absolute perfection. He walked around to the passenger side and carefully helped Elena out of the vehicle. She moved with agonizing slowness, leaning heavily against his side. Her face was pale, intentionally devoid of her usual expensive serums and makeup. She wore a thick cashmere scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, presenting the flawless, heartbreaking image of a woman who had just survived a catastrophic medical event. Arthur hurried down the icy stone steps, his hands outstretched and shaking. He embraced his daughter, letting out a fractured, theatrical sob that echoed in the freezing air. He felt her pat his back with weak, patronizing strokes. She murmured soft, spiritual platitudes about the universe testing their family bond and how her physical vessel was frail but her spirit was strong. Arthur agreed blindly, letting his fake tears freeze on his cheeks, while his mind coldly registered the steady, powerful, and entirely healthy rhythm of her pulse against his chest. They brought her inside, slowly navigating the grand foyer, and settled her into the expansive guest suite on the ground floor. It was a room Arthur had specifically chosen for them. The walls were deliberately thin, sharing a direct partition with his private study. Nathan carried in their designer luggage, a subtle sign of their misplaced priorities even in the face of a supposed medical emergency. As Nathan unpacked, Arthur brought them a tray of hot chamomile tea. He made sure his hands trembled violently, allowing the delicate porcelain cups to rattle loudly against the saucers. Arthur watched them settle into their temporary dominion. Nathan looked around the opulent room, his eyes lingering hungrily on the expensive landscape paintings and the heavy silver fixtures on the mantel. Arthur could almost hear the gears turning in Nathan's desperate mind, calculating the resale value of every single item in the house to pay off his South Side loan sharks. Elena closed her eyes, practicing her deep, meditative breathing, pretending to be a fragile soul hovering between two worlds. They were so incredibly confident in their deception. They believed they had successfully infiltrated a wealthy fortress, completely unaware that the fortress was actually a custom-built cage, and the heavy iron doors had just locked firmly behind them. The daytime hours at the Rossi estate became a sickening display of aggressive affection. When the winter sun illuminated the grand windows, Elena and Nathan transformed into the absolute epitome of a devoted family. Despite her supposed fragile state, Elena insisted on leaving her bed to sit by the living room fire. She would brew organic bone broth, filling the house with the savory scent of domestic warmth. She would insist Arthur sit beside her on the plush sofa, reaching out with perfectly manicured hands to gently massage his weary shoulders. She spoke in soft, rhythmic tones about gratitude, about how facing mortality had shown her the true value of their family bond. Nathan played the supportive pillar. He chopped firewood, brought Arthur his slippers, and made a performative show of checking his laptop for imaginary tech startup emails while nodding solemnly at every piece of spiritual wisdom his wife offered. Arthur accepted the soup. He leaned into the shoulder massages. He maintained the glassy, terrified stare of an old man paralyzed by the impending loss of his only child, playing his part in their grotesque daytime theater with flawless execution. But when the sun sank below the frozen Chicago horizon and the heavy oak doors of the guest suite clicked shut, the performance ended. The house settled into a profound, suffocating silence. In the pitch black of his private study, Arthur Rossi did not sleep. He sat motionless in his leather chair, the glow of the encrypted server screen painting his stoic face in a ghostly blue light. He carefully placed the heavy, noise-canceling headphones over his ears and turned the volume dial. Through the microscopic microphones hidden beneath the guest room floorboards and the dining room chandelier, their true voices bled directly into his mind. The contrast was physically jarring. The soft, enlightened guru vanished entirely. In her place was a sharp, calculating predator. Nathan was pacing. The microphones picked up the heavy, rhythmic thud of his footsteps crossing the hardwood floor over and over again. He sounded ragged, his voice tight with genuine, suffocating panic. "He is taking too long," Nathan hissed. "The bank requires in-person authorizations for a $150,000 transfer. That is bureaucratic garbage. My guys on the south side gave me until the end of the week. If I do not have that $80,000, they are going to find me. They know what kind of car I drive. They know where we live." "Keep your voice down," Elena commanded. The spiritual warmth in her tone had been replaced by ice. "You are projecting frantic energy, Nathan. It is pathetic. The old man is terrified. I have him eating out of the palm of my hand. He will get the cashier's check. He just needs to believe he is saving my soul while he does it. What if he stalls?" Nathan demanded, his breathing shallow. "What if the bank manager flags it as elder abuse? What if they put a hold on the account? We are entirely out of options. The Wellness Institute is going to be slapped with the class action lawsuit in less than 10 days. We are out of time." Arthur closed his eyes in the dark, listening to the absolute silence that followed Nathan's outburst. When Elena finally spoke again, the words were so devoid of humanity they chilled Arthur deeper than the Chicago winter outside. "If the bank gives him trouble, or if he suddenly decides to develop a backbone and stall, we pivot, Elena stated flatly. You have seen how he has been acting. The trembling hands. The constant crying. The obvious cognitive decline from the stress. He is a fragile, senile safekeeper. Nothing more. Arthur felt his jaw clench, but he kept his breathing perfectly steady. What do you mean by pivot? Nathan asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. We get a doctor to declare him mentally unfit, Elena explained, her voice steady and methodical. We file an emergency petition for medical guardianship and full power of attorney. If he cannot make financial decisions for himself due to dementia brought on by acute trauma, the court hands control of his estate directly to his only living relative. Me. Once I have the legal authority, I do not need his permission to authorize the transfer. I can liquidate the investments, secure a loan against this massive house, and clear your debts and my lawsuits in one afternoon. He is just an obstacle, Nathan. If he refuses to move, we simply step over him. The recording continued, capturing Nathan's hesitant but greedy agreement, followed by the mundane sounds of them getting into bed. Arthur reached out and pressed the save button on the server interface. He meticulously backed up the audio file to 3 separate, secure offshore cloud locations. Every terrible word was now preserved, cross-referenced, and locked away as undeniable, unassailable evidence. He slowly removed the headphones and placed them on the mahogany desk. The profound betrayal should have broken a father. Hearing his only child coldly plot to strip him of his legal autonomy, his dignity, and his wealth should have brought him to his knees in a puddle of tears. Instead, Arthur felt a profound, crystal-clear sense of liberation. The daughter he had mourned in the hospital closet was truly dead. The woman sleeping in the guest suite was merely an intruder, a thief attempting to break into his vault. By explicitly planning to declare him incompetent, Elena had crossed the final, irreversible boundary. It was no longer just a financial scam. It was a declaration of total war. Arthur sat in the dark, his eyes fixed on the locked steel cabinet. He did not need to wait anymore. He had the weapon he needed. It was time to execute the first phase of their destruction. Morning arrived with a blinding white glare reflecting off the frozen snow. Arthur had not slept a single minute. At dawn, long before the parasites in the guest suite began to stir, he opened a heavily encrypted communication channel. He did not contact local law enforcement. He reached out to a senior director within the Federal Anti-Fraud Division and a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man whose career Arthur had quietly salvaged 2 decades prior. Arthur uploaded the complete dossier Frank had assembled, the fake medical scans Dr. Aris had used, and the crystal-clear audio recordings from the previous night. He laid out his plan with absolute precision. He was going to hand over the money today. It was not a capitulation. It was a controlled delivery. Arthur requested the authorities to monitor the specific routing numbers attached to the check. He explicitly instructed the bank to allow the deposit to register just long enough to cement the criminal intent before freezing the entire network of accounts. Once the ink dried and the transaction initiated, the conspiracy would evolve from a theoretical plan into a documented, federal felony. Satisfied that the trap was perfectly primed, Arthur closed his laptop. He spent 10 minutes in the mirror practicing his physical deterioration. He dulled the sharpness in his eyes, allowed his jaw to slacken slightly, and adopted the unsteady, shuffling gait of a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. When he descended the grand staircase, the smell of organic oatmeal and fake domestic bliss filled the kitchen. Elena sat at the marble island, wrapped in a thick shawl, staring mournfully into her tea. Nathan stood beside her, his fingers tapping anxiously against the counter, a silent metronome of his mounting debts. Arthur shuffled into the room. He clutched a leather checkbook to his chest like a lifeline. He let out a long, ragged sigh, drawing their immediate, predatory attention. "Arthur," Nathan said, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. "You look exhausted. Did you not sleep?" "I spent the night praying," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling perfectly. praying for guidance. Praying for my little girl. He moved to the table and sank heavily into a chair. He opened the leather binder. Inside was a blank check linked to his primary wealth management account. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He held his hand suspended above the paper, forcing a violent, uncontrollable tremor into his fingers. The pen scratched against the crisp paper. $150,000. He wrote the name of Dr. Aneurysm as the payee, deliberately smudging the ink slightly to emphasize his supposed fragile state. He tore the check from the ledger and slid it across the cool marble surface toward his daughter. "Take it," Arthur choked out, forcing a single tear to spill over his lower eyelid. "Take it to the hospital. Pay the doctor. Book the surgery. Whatever it takes to keep you in this world, Elena. I do not care about the money anymore. My mind is tired. I just want my daughter safe." Elena looked at the piece of paper. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and Arthur saw the ravenous, blinding greed flash in her eyes. It was the look of a starving animal finding fresh meat. She quickly covered it, reaching out with both hands to clutch the check to her chest. She bowed her head, performing a flawless picture of spiritual reluctance. "Dad," she murmured, her voice thick with fake emotion. "This is a profound sacrifice. Your detachment from this material burden is a testament to your soul. The universe will honor this transaction. We will take this to Dr. Aneurysm immediately." Nathan stepped forward, resting a hand on Elena's shoulder. He was practically vibrating with relief. The threat of the South Side syndicate breaking his legs had just been entirely neutralized by a stroke of an old man's pen. "You are saving her life, Arthur. We will never forget this. Go." Arthur waved them away weakly, resting his head in his hands. "Go before the bank closes. Make sure the doctor deposits it today to secure the surgical theater." He listened to their hurried footsteps retreating down the hall. He heard the frantic rustling of winter coats and the heavy thud of the front door closing. The moment the lock clicked, Arthur lifted his head. The tears were gone. The trembling vanished entirely. He stood up, walking calmly to the massive bay window. He watched Nathan's car speed down the snowy driveway, tearing toward the city with the stolen prize. They thought they had just secured their salvation. They thought they had successfully drained a confused, broken old man. In reality, Arthur Rossi had just executed a flawless queen sacrifice. In the game of chess, sacrificing the most valuable piece on the board was a tactic used to draw the opponent out of their defensive position, blinding them with greed, right before delivering a brutal and inescapable checkmate. They had taken the bait. The countdown to their total annihilation had officially begun. Arthur watched the taillights of Nathan's car disappear into the blinding white landscape. The moment the vehicle was out of sight, Arthur turned away from the glass. He walked upstairs to his master suite, stripping off the thick wool cardigan that served as his costume of frailty. He dressed with the precise, methodical care of a general preparing for a final campaign. He chose a charcoal bespoke suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. The trembling old man was gone. The silent godfather of Chicago logistics had returned to the surface. He bypassed his usual driver and took the keys to a heavy, armored SUV he rarely used, navigating the cleared suburban roads toward the towering glass and steel monoliths of downtown Chicago. His destination was a prestigious corporate law firm perched on the 60th floor of a high-rise overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. It was a firm that specialized in impenetrable estate planning and wealth preservation for the city's elite. Arthur was escorted immediately into a vast, glass-walled conference room. A senior partner named Harrison waited for him. Harrison was a ruthless, brilliant legal architect who had helped Arthur legitimize his empire decades ago. The lawyer noted Arthur's sharp attire and the cold, unyielding posture, instantly recognizing that his oldest client was preparing for war. "Arthur," Harrison greeted him, offering a firm handshake. "Your call was urgent. What exactly are we restructuring today?" "Everything," Arthur replied, taking a seat at the massive mahogany table. I need to completely dissolve my current estate plan. The previous will, the living trust, the medical directives. All of it is to be shredded and replaced immediately. Harrison opened his leather folio, his pen poised. And the new beneficiaries? My daughter, Elena, is to be entirely removed from the primary inheritance, Arthur stated. His voice was level, completely devoid of hesitation or sorrow. The entirety of my liquid assets, the investment portfolios, the offshore holdings, and the deed to the suburban estate are to be transferred into a new, irrevocable charitable trust. Harrison raised an eyebrow, a rare display of surprise. An irrevocable trust. Once we file this, Arthur, you cannot change your mind. It places the assets completely out of your direct control, though you retain the right to live in the estate until your death. It is the ultimate shield, but it is permanent. That is precisely the point, Arthur said, his eyes hard and focused. I want the vault permanently sealed. The sole beneficiary of this new trust will be the Chicago Foundation for Orphan Children. They need the funds. The people currently living in my house only want to steal them. Harrison nodded, his legal mind quickly assembling the necessary framework. Understood. But if we completely omit Elena from the will, she will undoubtedly file a lawsuit claiming you were not of sound mind when you made the change. She will argue that you simply forgot her due to cognitive decline. I am well aware of her strategies, Arthur replied coldly, remembering the audio recording of Elena plotting to declare him incompetent. That is why you will not omit her. You will include a highly specific, undeniable provision. You will leave her exactly $1,000. Not a penny more. A slow, understanding smile spread across Harrison's face. It was a classic, brutal legal maneuver. By leaving a direct descendant a specific, nominal sum, it provided absolute proof to any probate judge that the testator was fully aware of the heir's existence and consciously, deliberately chose to limit their inheritance. It proved clear, undeniable intent. It was a legally bulletproof insult. $1,000, Harrison repeated, writing the figure down. It is a brilliant countermeasure. It completely neutralizes any claim of accidental omission or dementia. If she tries to contest the will, the judge will throw it out the moment they see that specific clause. The message is legally undeniable. I want the documents drafted, witnessed, and filed with the county recorder by the end of business today, Arthur commanded. For the next 3 hours, the conference room transformed into an assembly line of legal execution. Teams of paralegals hurried in and out, printing thick stacks of dense, heavily codified documents. Arthur read every single page, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He signed his name with steady, forceful strokes. He authorized the transfer of tens of millions of dollars into the charitable trust. 2 independent witnesses and a public notary verified his signature and his completely sound state of mind. When the final stamp was pressed onto the paper, the heavy iron doors of Arthur's vault slammed shut forever. His legacy was completely secured. The fortune he had built through decades of sweat and blood would go to children who had nothing, instead of parasites who wanted everything. Arthur stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He thanked Harrison and left the glass tower, descending back to the frozen streets of Chicago. He felt lighter, as if a massive, suffocating weight had been lifted from his chest. Elena and Nathan were currently speeding around the city, desperately trying to cash a monitored check to save their miserable, fraudulent lives, completely unaware that the vast inheritance they were plotting to steal no longer existed. Arthur drove back to the estate in the fading afternoon light. He parked the SUV, took off his sharp suit coat, and pulled the thick wool cardigan back over his shoulders. He mussed his hair and let his posture collapse into frailty. The paperwork was filed. The trap was set. Now, it was time to go back inside and wait for his daughter to make her next unforgivable move. Upon returning to the hushed halls of his estate, Arthur escalated his performance from mere frailty to profound cognitive collapse. He knew Elena and Nathan were waiting for a reason to seize control, so he decided to hand him the perfect illusion of a crumbling mind. Over the next 3 days, Arthur orchestrated a masterful symphony of senility. He began dropping things. A crystal glass slipped from his fingers during dinner, shattering against the hardwood floor. He did not apologize or react to the noise. He simply stared at the broken shards with a vacant, terrifyingly empty expression. The next morning, he walked into the kitchen and called Nathan by the name of a syndicate enforcer who had been dead for 20 years. He wandered the vast corridors of the house at midnight, clad only in his pajamas, pausing to speak in hushed, urgent tones to oil paintings of long-deceased relatives. Through the hidden microphones, Arthur listened to the fruits of his labor. The guest suite buzzed with malicious excitement. Nathan was ecstatic, whispering that the old man was finally breaking under the weight of his own age and the stress of his daughter's fake illness. Elena, however, remained coldly pragmatic. She declared that the time for waiting was over. The $150,000 check was still being processed by the federal banking bureaucracy, and the South Side syndicate was growing dangerously impatient. She needed direct, absolute access to Arthur's entire financial portfolio immediately. She needed power of attorney. To secure medical guardianship in the state of Illinois, one required a certified diagnosis from a licensed psychiatrist declaring the subject mentally unfit. Elena, entirely unwilling to risk a legitimate medical evaluation that would easily prove Arthur was perfectly sane, opted for the only method she truly understood. She resorted to bribery. She left the house on a Tuesday afternoon, claiming she needed to visit a holistic herbalist to aid her ongoing recovery. She wrapped her cashmere scarf tightly, kissing Arthur on the cheek with a performative display of daughterly affection. Arthur simply nodded from his armchair, a blank smile plastered across his face. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, the blankness vanished entirely. He sent a single, encrypted text message to Frank. The private investigator picked up her trail the second she entered the city limits. 3 hours later, Arthur sat in his locked study, reviewing the high-definition photographs Frank beamed directly to his secure server. Elena had not gone to an herbalist. She drove to a discreet, dimly lit cocktail lounge nestled in the affluent northern suburbs. There, she met with Dr. Silas Vance, a high-society psychiatrist notorious among the city elite. Vance was known for prescribing expensive narcotics to board executives and looking the other way when wealthy families needed inconvenient, aging relatives quietly institutionalized. He was a man utterly devoid of morals, making him the perfect accomplice for a woman utterly devoid of a soul. Frank was seated 2 booths away, sipping a bourbon, a modified telephoto lens hidden cleverly within his heavy winter coat. The photographs were flawlessly sharp, capturing the raw, ugly truth beneath Elena's enlightened facade. They captured Elena sliding a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. They captured Dr. Vance discreetly checking the thickness of the cash inside, his eyes gleaming with greed, before slipping it into his tailored suit jacket. The final sequence of images was the most damning. They showed the corrupt psychiatrist signing and stamping a formal state medical certificate, pushing it back across the table to a deeply satisfied Elena. Frank's accompanying text report confirmed the grim details. For the sum of $10,000, Dr. Vance had officially diagnosed Arthur Rossi with advanced, rapid-onset dementia. The forged document claimed Arthur was completely incapable of understanding his finances, managing his property, or caring for his own basic needs. It recommended the immediate, full transfer of legal and financial authority to his primary caregiver and closest living relative. Arthur traced the digital image of his daughter smiling over the fraudulent document. The hypocrisy was almost poetic. The woman who preached daily about the illusion of the ego, who sold expensive seminars on the purity of the spirit, was sitting in a shadowy bar buying her father's legal execution with a bride. She was constructing her own gallows with remarkable speed. Filing a forged psychiatric evaluation with a county judge to seize an estate was a severe federal offense. It elevated her crimes from simple financial fraud to an aggressive, multi-layered conspiracy. She was actively attempting to strip a United States citizen of his fundamental human rights. Later that evening, Elena returned to the estate. She carried herself with a new, dangerous confidence, the swagger of a predator that believed it had finally cornered its prey. She poured Arthur a cup of chamomile tea, her eyes tracking his every movement with the cold calculation of a warden observing a condemned prisoner. She casually mentioned that a notary public would be visiting the house the following morning to help organize some minor medical paperwork for her ongoing treatment. Arthur sipped the tea, his hands trembling right on cue, rattling the fine porcelain against the saucer. He knew exactly what the notary was truly for. Elena was bringing the final power of attorney documents to be signed. She planned to use the forged psychiatric evaluation to force his hand, believing his mind was too shattered to resist or even understand what he was signing. She believed she was holding the ultimate trump card, ready to claim her prize. Arthur looked at his daughter over the rim of his teacup and offered her a confused, vacant smile. He felt a dark, silent amusement blooming in his chest. Let the notary come, he thought. Let her try to bind him in paper chains. She was fighting a war for the keys to a kingdom that had already been given away to orphans. The silent godfather retreated behind his blank stare, perfectly ready for the next act. The following morning, the notary public arrived exactly as Elena had arranged. He was a nervous, sharply dressed man who seemed eager to collect his fee and asked no questions. Elena guided Arthur into the living room, placing the dense legal documents on the coffee table. She spoke to her father in the slow, overly enunciated tone reserved for toddlers and the profoundly deaf. She presented the forged psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Vance, casually sliding it into the stack, and pointed to the signature lines. Arthur played his part to perfection. He held the pen awkwardly, his hand trembling so violently that the ink blotted the crisp white paper. He asked confused questions about what day it was and whether his late wife was coming down for breakfast. Elena smiled a tight, triumphant smile, assuring him it was just standard medical paperwork for her ongoing recovery. Arthur signed the power of attorney. The notary stamped it, packed his briefcase, and left. Elena clutched the document to her chest, her eyes alight with the intoxicating rush of absolute control. She believed she had just legally conquered the Rossi estate. Arthur watched her, sipping his lukewarm tea, knowing she had just claimed ownership of a completely empty vault. The euphoria of her supposed victory lasted exactly 4 hours. Early that afternoon, the first bomb detonated. Arthur was sitting by the fireplace, staring blankly at the dancing flames, when Elena's cell phone rang. She answered it with her usual breathy, serene greeting. Within 3 seconds, the color completely drained from her face. Her posture went rigid. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough that Arthur could hear the frantic, panic pitch, even if he could not make out the exact words. It was Dr. Aneurysm. Elena turned her back to Arthur, pacing rapidly toward the far corner of the living room, pressing the phone tightly to her ear. Her whispered responses were sharp and venomous. She demanded the doctor calm down, reminding him of his spiritual center, but the psychiatric jargon failed entirely. Dr. Aneurysm was beyond manipulation. The $150,000 cashier's check had not cleared. The bank had not simply placed a standard hold on the massive transfer. They had flagged the transaction for severe irregularities and initiated a hard freeze on all accounts associated with the doctor's clinic. But the financial freeze was only the beginning of the nightmare. Dr. Aneurysm stammered out the truly terrifying news. 2 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just walked into the lobby of Chicago Lakeside Hospital. They were armed with federal warrants, demanding immediate access to his surgical theater logs, his patient billing histories, and his private offshore communication records. The doctor was screaming into the phone, accusing Elena of setting him up, threatening to expose the entire fraudulent operation to the authorities in exchange for a plea deal if she did not fix the situation immediately. Elena terminated the call. Her hands were shaking. The perfectly curated mask of the enlightened wellness guru was cracking, revealing the terrified, cornered animal underneath. She took 3 deep breaths, desperately trying to reconstruct her serene facade before turning back to face Arthur. He remained in his armchair, offering her a vacant, senile smile, completely masking the cold, calculating satisfaction blooming in his chest. "Is everything all right, my sweet girl?" Arthur asked, his voice wavering with manufactured innocence. "Everything is perfectly fine, Dad," Elena lied, her voice tight and high-pitched. "Just a minor bureaucratic delay with the hospital administration. I am going to lie down for a moment. My energy is feeling a bit depleted." She practically fled the room. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the snowy estate, the second bomb dropped. This one was far less bureaucratic and far more brutal. Nathan had bundled up in his heavy winter coat, announcing he needed to retrieve his laptop charger from his luxury sedan parked in the sprawling driveway. Arthur watched through the frosty bay window. Nathan approached his vehicle, casually pressing the unlock button on his key fob. He opened the driver's side door. Arthur saw Nathan freeze. The younger man stumbled backward, slipping on a patch of ice, his eyes locked in sheer horror at the driver's seat. Someone had bypassed the heavy security gates of the suburban neighborhood. Resting perfectly in the center of Nathan's expensive leather seat was a massive, rotting dead rat. Its throat had been brutally slashed, the dark blood staining the pristine upholstery. Pinned to the rat's stiff, lifeless body with a rusted hunting knife was a single piece of heavy cardstock. Nathan scrambled forward, his hands shaking violently as he pulled the note free. Even from the window, Arthur knew exactly what the message said, having received the update from Frank an hour prior. The South Side Syndicate was done waiting for their $80,000. The note was a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. They had exactly 48 hours to deliver the cash. If they failed, the next body left bleeding on the leather seats would be Nathan's. Nathan slammed the car door shut, sprinting back toward the house like a man being chased by demons. He burst through the front door, panting heavily, his face the color of wet ash. He did not even look at Arthur. He ran straight down the hallway and threw open the door to the guest suite, locking it securely behind him. That night, the hidden microphones in Arthur's study captured the glorious sound of total, unadulterated panic. The hushed whispers of the guest room had devolved into frantic, desperate arguments. Nathan was hyperventilating, crying about the dead rat and the syndicate enforcers who knew where he slept. Elena was pacing like a caged tiger, cursing Dr. Aneurysm and the federal agents dismantling her carefully constructed hospital scam. The noose had been slipped around their necks, and the trapdoor had just swung open. They were hanging in midair, choking on their own lies, debts, and federal crimes. And as they scrambled for a way to survive the tightening rope, Arthur Rossi sat in the dark, patiently waiting for them to make the final, fatal mistake that would break their necks forever. The morning after the dead rat appeared in the driveway, the sprawling Rossi estate felt like a mausoleum. The oppressive silence was thick with the stench of pure desperation. Nathan appeared at the breakfast table looking like a man walking to his own execution. His skin was sallow, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically at every shadow. He had not slept. The clock was aggressively ticking down the final 48 hours the South Side Syndicate had graciously afforded him. Elena was not faring much better. The pristine facade of the wellness guru had completely shattered, replaced by the twitching, hyperventilating reality of a cornered criminal. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with frantic updates from Dr. Aneurysm, who was currently drowning under the weight of federal subpoenas. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, wearing his thick wool cardigan and a perfectly vacant expression. He slowly stirred his morning tea, the spoon clinking rhythmically against the porcelain. He watched his daughter and son-in-law exchange terrified, unspoken communications across the plates of untouched organic eggs. They were suffocating under the pressure, precisely as Arthur had designed. Desperation was a potent poison. It eroded logic, destroyed patience, and forced rats to abandon the shadows and run directly into the light. Later that afternoon, Arthur gave them the exact opening they so desperately needed. He shuffled out of his private study, deliberately leaving the heavy oak door slightly ajar. Inside, the wall safe hidden behind an oil painting was left completely unlocked, an orchestrated mistake by a supposedly senile old man. Arthur ambled into the living room, sat in his favorite armchair, and pretended to fall into a deep, oblivious slumber. Through slightly parted eyelids, Arthur watched Nathan creep down the hallway. The younger man was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring the old man was asleep, before slipping into the study. Arthur did not need to see inside the room to know exactly what was happening. He had anticipated this move. He knew Nathan would bypass the jewelry and the negligible stacks of emergency cash. A man owing $80,000 to violent loan sharks needed massive, immediate capital. Nathan was hunting for the crown jewel. He was looking for the physical deed to the Rossi estate. 10 minutes later, Nathan emerged from the study. He was sweating profusely, clutching a thick manila folder tightly against his ribs. He hurried directly to the guest suite, locking the door behind him. Arthur remained perfectly still in his armchair, maintaining his steady, rhythmic breathing. He visualized the audio servers in his hidden cabinet capturing every panicked whisper now echoing through the guest suite. Nathan and Elena were laying out their final, fatal strategy. Elena had the freshly notarized power of attorney, a document she mistakenly believed granted her supreme legal authority over Arthur's entire financial existence. Nathan possessed the stolen physical deed to the multi-million-dollar suburban estate. Combined, they held what they thought was the ultimate key to their salvation. The plan they hurriedly whispered into Arthur's hidden microphones was an act of breathtaking financial suicide. Nathan had contacted a predatory, gray market lending firm operating out of a strip mall in the city. These shadow financiers did not care about credit scores or lengthy underwriting processes. They offered immediate, high-interest cash loans secured against high-value real estate. Nathan intended to march into their office the following morning, present the forged power of attorney, and use the stolen deed as collateral to secure a massive loan. He calculated they could extract $500,000 in a matter of hours. It would be more than enough to pay off the South Side syndicate, bribe Dr. Aris to keep quiet, and fund their immediate escape from Chicago. They congratulated themselves in the dark, believing their sheer audacity had saved their lives. They praised Elena for having the foresight to bribe the corrupt psychiatrist, and they praised Nathan for having the courage to steal the deed. They were convinced the senile old man sleeping in the living room would never even realize his home had been mortgaged out from under him until they were already thousands of miles away. Arthur opened his eyes. He reached for his teacup, the porcelain entirely steady in his grasp. The liquid had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. The sheer, towering arrogance of their plan was almost beautiful to witness. They were about to walk into a financial institution and present a forged document to secure a loan against a property that Arthur Rossi no longer owned. They were completely oblivious to the legal trap Arthur had set days ago in the glass tower downtown. The estate belonged to an irrevocable charitable trust. By attempting to mortgage an asset owned by a charity using fraudulent authorization papers, Nathan was about to commit an egregious, undeniable act of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Arthur set his teacup down and stared out the frosty window at the gathering winter dusk. He had given them the rope. He had shown them where to tie the knot. Now, all he had to do was wait for tomorrow morning, when Nathan would finally place his own head perfectly inside the noose. The sun had barely begun to scrape the icy Chicago skyline when Nathan Hayes slipped out of the guest suite. He moved with the exaggerated quiet of a thief, his heavy winter coat zipped tight, the manila folder clutched securely under his arm. He did not bother to check on his father-in-law. He simply hurried out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind him, sealing his fate. He walked toward his luxury sedan, ignoring the lingering metallic scent of the dead rat from the day before, his mind entirely consumed by the $500,000 payday waiting for him downtown. Inside the master suite, Arthur Rossi stood by the window and watched the taillights fade into the gray dawn. He did not return to his bed. The time for pretending to be a frail, broken old man was officially over. Arthur moved to his expansive walk-in closet. He bypassed the thick wool cardigans and soft slippers that had served as his uniform of senility. He reached for a bespoke, charcoal gray suit tailored to absolute perfection. He selected a crisp white shirt, a dark silk tie, and a pair of polished leather Oxfords. He dressed with the methodical, unhurried precision of an executioner preparing for the block. When he looked in the mirror, the confused, trembling elder was entirely gone. The silent godfather had returned, his eyes sharp, clear, and deadly cold. He pulled a secure cellular phone from his pocket and dialed his contact at the Federal Anti-Fraud Division. He provided the exact address of the gray market lending firm in the city, confirming that the target was en route with the forged federal documents. The trap was armed. Arthur walked downstairs, bypassing the kitchen where Elena was still blissfully asleep, and stepped into the waiting black town car driven by Frank. Miles away, in a nondescript strip mall office nestled in the commercial district, Nathan sat across a faux mahogany desk from a sleazy loan officer. The air smelled of cheap coffee and stale cologne. The officer, a man who made his living preying on the desperate, greedily examined the physical deed to the Rossi estate and the pristine power of attorney document bearing Dr. Vance's forged psychiatric seal. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Hayes," the loan officer said, his eyes gleaming at the massive appraisal value of the suburban property. "Your father-in-law's cognitive decline is tragic, but it is fortunate he has you to manage his medical expenses. We can authorize a wire transfer of $500,000 to your designated account within the hour. I just need your signature on the final collateral agreement." Nathan's hands shook, not from fear, but from the intoxicating rush of absolute greed. He reached for the heavy brass pin. He saw his salvation. He saw the South Side syndicate paid off. He saw a massive surplus of cash to fund his escape. He pressed the pen to the paper, signing his own name, and then formally signing as the legal proxy for Arthur Rossi. The ink soaked into the paper. The transaction was complete. The felony was sealed. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the small office. It was shattered 3 seconds later. The glass front doors of the lending firm did not just open. They were violently thrown inward. A team of federal agents clad in dark tactical gear flooded the lobby. The sheer speed and aggression of the raid paralyzed everyone in the room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the lead agent roared, his voice bouncing off the cheap acoustic ceiling tiles. "Nobody move. Keep your hands flat on the desks." Nathan froze, the brass pen slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. The loan officer immediately threw his hands in the air, recognizing a raid when he saw one. Before Nathan could even process the words, a heavy hand grabbed the back of his expensive winter coat. He was violently yanked out of his leather chair and slammed face first against the faux mahogany desk. Cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin. "Nathan Hayes," the lead agent stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he pulled the terrified man back to his feet. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and the forging of medical and federal documents. You are also being charged with attempting to defraud a registered charitable trust." Nathan gasped, his breath fogging in the cold air rushing through the open doors. "Charitable trust? What are you talking about?" "That is my father-in-law's house. I have power of attorney." The crowd of federal agents parted slightly. From the quiet shadows of a corner office, a figure stepped forward. Nathan's eyes widened in absolute, mind-shattering horror. Arthur Rossi stood in the center of the lobby. He looked immaculate in his charcoal suit. His posture was ramrod straight. His face held no confusion, no senility, and no fear. He looked exactly like the ruthless syndicate boss he had been decades ago. "Arthur," Nathan choked out, his voice cracking, desperate for the old man to intervene. "Arthur, tell them. Tell them you gave me the papers. Tell them it is a mistake." Arthur did not shout. He did not hurl accusations. He did not offer a single word of complaint or anger. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back and stared at the miserable parasite writhing in federal custody. The look in Arthur's eyes was so incredibly cold, so devoid of any human empathy, that the truth finally crashed down upon Nathan with the weight of a falling building. The safe had not been left open by accident. The dementia was a theatrical performance. The old man had orchestrated every single second of this nightmare. There was no inheritance. There was only a trap, and Nathan had walked directly into the center of it with a smile on his face. Arthur watched in absolute silence as the agents dragged his son-in-law out the shattered doors and pushed him into the back of a waiting armored vehicle. The epic song of justice had reached its crescendo. One parasite had been surgically removed. Arthur adjusted his silk cuffs, turned away from the flashing red and blue lights, and walked back to his waiting town car. Half the war was won. It was time to return to the estate and destroy the mask of the ego once and for all. Arthur returned to the silent, snow-covered estate just before noon. He dismissed Frank at the front door and walked into the grand foyer, his leather Oxfords clicking sharply against the marble. He did not change out of his charcoal suit. He walked into the living room, poured himself a small glass of aged bourbon, and took a seat in his favorite armchair by the fire. He did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the guest suite burst open. Elena tore down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood. The serenity of the wellness guru had been completely obliterated. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her hair a wild, tangled mess. She was clutching her cell phone so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Someone, likely a court-appointed attorney or a sympathetic federal agent, had just called her. She ran into the living room, a rehearsed wail of agony already building in her throat. "Dad," she screamed, dropping to her knees on the Persian rug. "Dad, it is Nathan. The federal authorities arrested him. They took him. They are charging him with fraud. You have to call your lawyers. You have to save him." She scrambled forward, reaching out to grasp Arthur's knees, preparing to drown him in her toxic empathy. She looked up, expecting to see the confused, trembling old man in a wool cardigan. Instead, she found herself staring into the freezing, razor-sharp eyes of the silent godfather. Arthur did not recoil. He did not reach out to comfort her. He simply took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Stop performing, Elena," Arthur commanded. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the frail quiver she had grown so accustomed to hearing. Elena froze. Her hands hovered in the air. The tears instantly stopped falling. She stared at the immaculate charcoal suit, the steady hands holding the crystal glass, and the absolute clarity in her father's eyes. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her. "I said, stop performing," Arthur repeated, placing the glass on the coffee table. "The curtain has closed. The audience has left the theater. There is no one left to manipulate." "Dad," Elena stammered, her voice dropping its breathy, spiritual cadence, revealing the harsh, grating reality. "What is wrong with you? Nathan is in a federal holding cell. They are saying he forged documents. They are saying he tried to steal a charitable trust." "He did," Arthur replied smoothly. "Because I placed the estate into an irrevocable charity 3 days ago. I also alerted the Federal Bureau of Investigation to his appointment at the gray market lending firm this morning. I handed him to the wolves." Elena recoiled as if she had been physically struck. "You. But your mind, the dementia. Dr. Vance diagnosed you." Dr. Vance took a $10,000 bribe in a dimly lit cocktail lounge to forge a psychiatric evaluation, Arthur corrected her, leaning forward slightly. "A bribe you paid, Elena. I know this because my private investigator was sitting 2 booths away, photographing the entire transaction." Elena scrambled backward, her back hitting the heavy mahogany coffee table. The mask of the ego, the pristine shell of the enlightened healer, was cracking violently into a million jagged pieces. She tried to pivot, desperately reaching for her usual psychological weaponry. "You are projecting your trauma, Dad. You are confused. We were trying to protect you. You are sick." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. He aimed it at the hidden audio system he had installed perfectly throughout the living room. He pressed a single button. The high-fidelity speakers cracked to life. The audio was crystal clear. Elena's own voice echoed through the vast, quiet room. "He is a fragile, senile safekeeper. Nothing more. We get a doctor to declare him mentally unfit. Once I have the legal authority, I do not need his permission to authorize the transfer. He is just an obstacle, Nathan. If he refuses to move, we simply step over him." Arthur pressed the button again, cutting the audio. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Elena sat on the floor, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. There was no spiritual justification for those words. There was no psychological maneuvering that could erase the cold, calculated malice in her own recorded voice. She had been stripped entirely naked, her black, greedy soul laid bare for the only man she had ever truly feared. Arthur reached into his suit jacket and pulled out 2 crisp, folded documents. He tossed them onto the coffee table, letting them land right next to Elena's trembling hands. "The first document is a permanent restraining order," Arthur stated, his tone clinical and final. "Signed by a superior court judge 2 hours ago. It prohibits you from coming within 1,000 feet of me, my properties, or my associates." The second document is a 24-hour eviction notice. Elena stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. "Eviction? Dad, please. The Wellness Institute is bankrupt. The federal agents are going to freeze all my accounts because of Nathan. I have absolutely nothing left. Where am I supposed to go?" "That is a problem for your karma to solve," Arthur replied, picking up his bourbon. "You preached for years about the toxic nature of material attachment. You told your victims that losing their wealth was a spiritual liberation. Congratulations, Elena. You are about to become the most liberated woman in Chicago." "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood," she hissed, genuine, unadulterated venom finally spilling from her lips. The saint was dead. The demon was exposed. "I am your daughter. My daughter died in a hospital supply closet the moment she tried to extort $150,000 from her grieving father," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet rumble. "The woman sitting on my floor is a trespasser. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your designer luggage and vacate my property. If you are still inside this house when the clock strikes noon tomorrow, I will have the police drag you out in handcuffs to join your husband." Arthur stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not spare her a second glance as he turned and walked toward his private study, leaving the shattered remains of his greatest enemy weeping alone on the floor of the empire she had failed to steal. Time flowed forward, washing away the bitter winter. Spring arrived in Chicago, thawing the frozen grounds of the Rossi estate. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut to the outside world, but inside, the air was light and pure. The scent of organic bone broth and fake domestic bliss had been scrubbed away entirely, replaced by the comforting aroma of old paper and Earl Grey tea. Nathan Hayes was currently residing in a federal penitentiary in a neighboring state. His trial had been remarkably brief. The forged medical evaluations, the stolen property deed, the crystal-clear audio recordings, and the terrified testimony of a gray market loan officer had secured him a sentence of 10 years. There were no brilliant tech startups in his concrete cell. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of consequence. Elena had not fared any better. Stripped of her access to the Rossi estate and publicly exposed by the federal investigation surrounding her husband, her Aura Wellness Institute imploded in a matter of days. The class action lawsuit drained her non-existent accounts. The underground syndicate, realizing Nathan was securely behind bars and out of reach, turned their aggressive collection efforts toward his wife. Terrified and completely bankrupt, Elena was forced to flee the state in the middle of the night. The former spiritual guru was last reported to be working the graveyard shift as a waitress in a rundown diner in Nevada. She lived in a cramped motel room, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every shadow, and drowning in the exact material poverty she used to mock. The illusion of her ego had been entirely shattered, leaving nothing but fear. Back in Chicago, Arthur Rossi sat in his private study. The warm afternoon sun streamed through the bay window, illuminating the intricate wooden pieces of his solitary chessboard. He took a slow sip of his tea. His house was his own again. His vast wealth was securely out of reach, quietly funding the futures of orphaned children who truly needed the support. The silent godfather moved a white knight across the checkered board, securing a flawless victory. The silence in the room was not empty. It was the sound of absolute peace. Justice had been correctly applied, not with messy anger or loud violence, but with infinite patience and unyielding truth. The story of Arthur Rossi carries a profound lesson about the realities of human nature and the values we choose to uphold. It reminds us that the most dangerous individuals often hide behind a mask of profound goodness, spiritual enlightenment, and false empathy. True love and compassion are demonstrated through genuine actions and respect, not through empty words designed to manipulate and control. Arthur teaches us that setting firm boundaries and allowing toxic individuals to face the natural consequences of their own choices is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of necessary justice and self-preservation. We must protect our peace, our dignity, and our integrity, even if it means walking away from those who share our blood but refuse to share our moral values. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever encountered someone who wore a perfect mask to hide a selfish heart, and how do you relate the events of this story to your own real-life experiences? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We truly want to listen to the feelings and reflections coming from deep within your heart. If you found value in this narrative, please click the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends so you can listen to more engaging, dramatic, and captivating stories every single day. We want to send our warmest wishes to everyone watching this video right now. May you have excellent health, a joyful life filled with happiness every single day, and profound, lasting peace in your soul. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.